Welcome everyone to this week's CERIAS security seminar. We are very pleased to have Robert Dennis with us. He's the director of the Security and Resilient Systems Group at Riverside Research and has a lot of experience in security, in particular AI, formal methods for security. Has been the PI and co-PI in several DoD and DARPA grants. And we are very happy to have you talk us about Mind the Gap, vulnerabilities and opportunities for cyber R&D at the edge.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'd like to kind of start out these lectures a little bit different. Kind of obviously not a huge audience, but hopefully show of hands of anyone owning a Lenovo laptop. If you can maybe raise your hand on the Zoom, and then potentially. For the gamers in the group, anyone who's building their own computer, if you own a gigabyte motherboard, raise your hand, and I'll happily raise my hand to that one, having built another computer recently. The reason I bring that up is, we think of cybersecurity often as just the software within the system, but more and more frequently, it's the hardware working with the software that the vulnerabilities are presenting themselves. And in those particular use cases, Lenovo back around 2012, 2013, got in trouble for having backdoors in their BIOS, and more recently, Gigabyte got in trouble with backdoors in their UEFI system, which is what replaced BIOS. So talking about this, a little bit further. I'll give you a little bit of background of how I got interested into this field. I'll talk about the motivation of security of where these gaps come from my viewpoint. Minding the gap. Everybody gets an opinion. Big part of this is the adversary has an opinion on what these gaps are, and then how did the gap get? And kind of a little bit of perspective from my side of how the gap got as large as it is. And then a little bit motivation of some of the near-term things that are ongoing, and then some of the longer-term things that we've been looking at on the Riverside research side. So talking a little bit about myself, most of my time has been from the beginning of my career, back all the way in 2004 when I was undergrad at RPI. I interned for the Air Force. I've been in cybersecurity. Since then, largely been on the DoD side, small stint in healthcare, which scared me to go back to the DoD side a little bit. But I started out working in anti-tamper and multi-level security, which likely means nothing to a lot of people in this crowd. But anti-tamper, think of it as if you don't have physical control of the device and someone is trying to steal the information off of your device, you usually have a series of hardware and software mechanisms to protect that device from losing the data. And then on the multi-level security side, think about the DoD. They have a lot of different classified networks, and you have to often air gap between them. Multi-level security lets you merge those networks back together. You'll actually see this in the commercial side, especially in like power and gas, where you'll have often commercial networks, production networks, development networks, and if you're familiar with the Colonial Pipeline side of it, the network that came down because of ransomware was the billing network, which then took down the pipeline network because they didn't know how much fuel was flowing through that pipeline. So getting my start in the career there was a lot of really interesting work in both hardware and software and how that worked. And that was where I actually ended up going back to Dartmouth College and started, more of my focus with DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And so really focused on secure hypervisor operating system design in the R&D space. So really blue sky type research. After that, I actually switched back into more edge engineering. R&D is fun, but sometimes, you really want to see what's being out there in the field. And that's where you see in the pictures there, I got to work with a number of naval systems and looking at some of the challenges of deploying security to systems that sometimes are 10, 20, or 30 years old. And how do I get something that I may have developed on x86 over to PowerPC? What are the challenges in those type of environments where you have operators who are not PhDs and definitely a lot of times not really versed in cybersecurity in general and protecting those systems. Coming back to R&D, I get to work on a lot of fun projects doing larger system security design. So one of the other pictures there you see is looking at low Earth orbit satellites, working the DARPA PIT-BOSS program where they're looking at the security design of putting those satellites into space and how to communicate with them. And then most recently, in 3 years and since February, I've been at Riverside Research, leading a team of about 20 folks doing advanced R&D again in cybersecurity, covering hardware, software, RF, a lot of edge compute type devices where we don't see a lot of that pure focus that we do of large scale program analysis or fuzzing that we have for a lot of our standard open source libraries. So that's a little bit about me, but how do we get here in terms of these systems? Obviously, we as security researchers all believe that we should build security from day one. What we'll come to realize is a lot of times in both commercial and on the defense side, you're building a system to meet a mission, or you're building a system to provide a product to a commercial entity. And in doing that, you're designing for that mission or that need first. Then what we often do is after we have that, then we go, okay, especially on the side that I've worked is that system safe? So if I build something, can I safely use it? Can I safely use it around someone else? And then after that, we start adding in the security layers. Unfortunately, if you look at a lot of things that can happen with cybersecurity in general, the simple solution is let's take GPS spoofing. If you're flying a drone, an adversary may GPS spoof you, and then you've been denied the mission. Worst case scenario, you have more destructive cyber attacks. One that was caught in the United States would have been the water plant down in Florida, where there was malware discovered that was attempting to change the chemical mixtures within the water plant. An actual example of this would be more of a Stuxnet-like system that broke a industrial control system. But ultimately, it's always a game of getting into these systems and being able to laterally move across usually different types of environments that have non-homogeneous kind of surfaces in terms of the cybersecurity layout. We're talking PowerPC, control buses, and those type of architectures within the system. So trying to kind of graphically represent this, for illustrative purposes, we can debate where some of these bubbles kind of go, ultimately where we see it. On our side, we did software assurance for a long period of time. Now the new way that we're seeing this rebranded is software bill of materials, like knowing the provenance and the control and the integrity of all of that software, especially open source software, as it comes from the system. Previously, we would call this software assurance. Then we have the traditional software cyber mechanisms that largely a lot of us are all very familiar with. On the hardware cyber side, that's where you have things like trusted execution environments, trusted platform modules on the commercially available side. And then on the other, as you get into more interesting things, you get custom hardware designs, which there's a number of university researchers out there exploring that. Hardware assurance, can be looked at as a mixture of that software assurance side, but looking more at the firmware type problem of like FPGAs. It gets a little blurry in the UEFI and the, like say a GPU driver space. And so you can kind of bin those in one side or the other or both. And then, supply chain, moving away from software, bill of materials, like pure supply chain. Where's my hardware coming from? Who's manufacturing it? How do I trust that, this piece of hardware is what I actually wanted in the system? But ultimately, as developers, if you're a hardware developer, you're thinking, how is my chip secure? You're not thinking a lot of times, how's the software going to interact with this piece of hardware? You design the interface and then you hand it to the software developer, and your gap focus is looking at what's the security of that piece of hardware. And similarly on the software side, you assume the hardware is going to behave according to the specification you're given it. And so we think about on the software side, DevSecOps and all of those traditional security mechanisms that we have available to us. And then we kind of ignore the hardware side. Ultimately, we're all responsible for this. From an overload perspective, you necessarily aren't going to be an expert on all of these. However, the fun part about this talk is our adversaries and researchers, this is where we get to spend a lot of our time, is thinking about those gaps between those systems and then either exploiting them or developing, defenses around those mechanisms to see where we can go. So if you take a pure software only type look on the system, the SolarWinds attack, I'm sure most folks have seen and heard about. I like to think of this as, who's watching the watchman type approach. So we have a DevSecOps pipeline. We assume it's safe. We assume it's secure. Someone gets into the patch server and we start pushing a ton of vulnerabilities out to thousands of devices. It's that implicit trust mechanism. A more recent one of them is if you saw the Fortinet vulnerabilities that were discovered out in Guam, where you basically breached the edge devices that were designed to protect our systems. Ultimately, the gaps in the SolarWinds example is lack of controls to do supply chain trust in terms of that DevSecOps pipeline. If you want to see a great set of research, Dr. Lori Williams at NC State has just been recently published a whole guide on how to do better software supply chain security as a starting point. Obviously, reactively, software bill of materials, knowing where all of our software is, sure, that helps us, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of, hey, there was a vulnerability in this open source software. It doesn't get us to the point of patching it. Log4Shell, that's always an interesting one because it's basically open source software. It was a vulnerability that existed for many years, and we didn't know it was there until it became a reality. Straightforward attack that I'm going to talk about a lot, but input sanitization. So parsers are pretty much everywhere in our code, and there's a huge body of research out there now that's looking at formally verifying parsers, secure parsers, and so thinking about ways that we can include those is obviously a more long-term solution in that space. And then obviously I have to include boot hole, Black Lotus, because this is where I started my career. Buffer overflows in BIOS was a huge problem back in 2004, 2008. And lo and behold, boot hole, UEFI buffer overflow, and then again, the same buffer overflow in 2023. So a lot of these problems, they don't go away quickly. We solve them or we don't solve them, or we don't, put out the patches that we necessarily need to on the software side. But we don't have to beat up just the software folks. There's the same problem on the hardware side. Trusted execution environments, ARM Trust Zone, being the big, exemplar in this space. We're given hardware capabilities that allow us to secure, a very secure space to perform computing in, and then the hardware developers, hand it over to the software developers, and then we, go ahead and, mess things up between that hardware and software interface. So these are, the hardware developers don't come up with as much fun names on their CVEs, so I, just name them here a little bit. QCCOM is a good example of this. So in ARM, you have the trusted world and the untrusted world, and this was just a messaging service between those that had a buffer overflow. The sad part about this one was the lack of ASLR, which is something that we've had on the software side for a long period of time, which is address space layout randomization, which basically means your program gets reordered every time it's loaded. Allowed this vulnerability to be repeated over a wide spread of systems without much mucking around in terms of the lack of randomization. Potentially longer term, there's some tagged architecture research that's going on both in commercial and heavily in the RISC-V space that could potentially be a good help here. And then just always a fun one, Keymaster. They actually rolled their own crypto. And they reuse the input initialization vector in that code, which led then to key reuse attacks, and then all of a sudden the keys are leaking out. And the simple solution when it comes to crypto is don't ever roll your own crypto. We've got cryptographers on our team. We don't roll our own crypto. We use a lot of the libraries that a lot of other folks have been staring at for a number of years. So how did we kind of get here? So I'm an OS developer by trade. I did my PhD work in operating systems, hypervisors, the virtualization layer. And if you go out there today and you search operating system stack, you get this pretty picture on the right that says, here's your hardware, here's your hypervisor, here's your operating system, here's your application space. And as humans, we look at this and we have a false notion that the hardware is very stable. It's the same size, if not bigger, than everything else on the system. The application space, the applications, the operating systems are often much smaller. And in reality, if you look down here, a lot of the work that's done by another colleague of mine at Riverside Research, Dr. Scott Brooks, he documented this in the Transcending the Teetering Tower of Trust. The hardware is actually a very small footprint of your system. And so if you're asking your hardware to protect the layer above it, then you have, say a hypervisor, which is then multiplexing an operating system, which is then multiplexing applications. And any disruption at those lower layers leads to significant compromise is at the higher layers. And oftentimes we view the hardware as very stable and it can do a lot more for us. And largely because of this notion that, we show this picture, which I'm also guilty of, doing, but trying to think of these things a little bit differently is that we have a small trusted compute base that needs to manage a very large untrusted compute base. So what have we done to date? Obviously I'm a researcher in this field. A lot of this has been putting security in a lower layer. So when hypervisors came out, that was where a lot of my focus was working, at that layer below it to provide a lot of introspection and control of the operating system and the applications above that space. However, then we found out about system management mode, and the solution to system management mode was put a hypervisor inside of system management mode. And then when we did that, we got the management engine. And these are kind of x86 examples where we're effectively just turtles all the way down in terms of, just keep going lower, add more code, add more software, and eventually we'll get to the, that perfect ground truth of protection. Another way of looking at this, which has seen, I'd say, arguably a lot more success, is strengthening in the layer itself. So formal methods, we do a lot of work with that in that space, being able to prove that a core piece of your system is secure. You can't necessarily make guarantees around it, and we're working on that as an open problem. And then obviously there's just access control. The challenge obviously with access control is just scalability. For anyone who's had to work with SE Linux or XSM Flask, being able to make sure that you set that up correctly from a configuration management perspective is sometimes a daunting task. And then obviously the bigger area of research that I'd say is kind of emerging now is it's confidential computing, or being able to encrypt your software, so you have like fully homomorphic encryption, which isn't necessarily fast. You have Intel SGX, which obviously has been attacked numerous times at this point, and being able to somehow protect from the outside world your software encrypted and then hope it doesn't leak out. But then another area of, I'd say, interesting research, especially as first we saw the delay. We didn't see processing speeds continue to increase anymore. So then we got multi-core. Now we have multi-core, but you don't necessarily see a huge traction of people making good use of multi-core systems. So now you get a lot more multi-processor system on chips. You've got AI accelerators, you have GPU accelerators, and you're seeing this more of a federated process of moving all of these pieces out to various accelerated compute modes and then kind of coming back together, which I think is a promising area of research, because I don't think we have done necessarily a ton of due diligence in terms of, well, how did I trust that my GPU did something correctly versus my general purpose processor, which I understand a lot better. And so another way we're looking at this, which is not working, is frameworks. So we've built out all of these software systems to be able to pull in packages that we assume we trust. This is a great example from Dr. Ryan Craven's program at ONR. So NC State runs a mini node program. And so everyone here is probably familiar with the RF command, removes files, removes directories from your system. And everyone's probably also familiar with the node package management, which is used to host JavaScript. So there's a function or a program on NPM called rimraf, and its sole job is to run rm-rf. And what you see there is highlighted in red is rm-rf on NPM is 278 kilobytes in size, and has 137 files that is associated with it. That is absurd from a OS researcher background. That's absurdly large from a, do I really need that much code and software to remove files and directories from my system? Thankfully, ONR is obviously doing a lot of great work here in this space, being able to debloat effectively these packages. And especially as we move more into, we see an ever increasing amount of IoT and deployed devices. Do you really need 64 gigs of RAM on your smartwatch or, things like that? Like, can we do, as security researchers, can we provide frameworks and tools for individuals to actually start making smaller, well-defined, well-controlled packages, which likewise will make the formal methods process, which is, pretty effective at securing things, easier if we remove a lot of code that we have to keep within our trust boundaries. So this is actually a fun one and kind of motivating a lot of where we're headed. AI is going to make the problem both better and worse. So going back to my grad school days, with what you see on the right is that Intel just introduced the AES-NI instructions, which would be encryption coprocessors built in within the system. GCC at the time did not support that. So myself, another grad student, dug into the Intel processor manual and started learning bytecode and wrote up that code to basically build a 64-bit random number generator so that we could actually get a random number without having to write our own pseudo random number generator code, because remember, don't roll your own crypto if someone else is going to give you something. And taking an LLM like Google Bard's project, what you see there is the series of questions that I had to ask it to produce effectively the same code that took us about 4 man hours to write. That took me all about 5 minutes with Google Bard, being able to produce that code. So obviously there's expert knowledge involved in that question asking, which is a key part of this, because if you look through this, like a lot of the initial things that it generates is not what I actually would want. Like, so a lot of times it would generate, here's a 32-bit random number. And I'm like, well, I'm working with 64-bit data and I need 64 bits of random number. So there's that's where, there's some challenges still of like, you have to have expert knowledge. But I don't think from a security research side, if we go to the next slide here, everyone is necessarily going to agree with that we need expert knowledge. And obviously this isn't something I've had time to dig into deeper, but it was pretty interesting that, on ChatGPT 4 came out in March, and then all of a sudden the package repository in NPM increased by like 1 million packages. So, the ability for large language models to write code, not necessarily code that's been looked at by an expert, is certainly going to make the challenge as security researchers a lot harder. So we need to, a lot of times we've thought about, vulnerability amplification and, how to break things from homogeneous systems. Like not everybody's running Windows, not everyone's running, Linux. How do we make things more heterogeneous? We have to start rethinking, how we're looking at systems from a larger, mitigation amplification side of, code is going to be generated faster than likely, we fully understand yet. It's probably happening already. I don't have, the perfect metrics on that, but from a security research standpoint, we need to think about the fact that there's, maybe 30, 40 of us in this seminar, and there's probably, thousands or tens of thousands of people at any minute, generally learning computer science, like say at Purdue alone. So how do we start actually addressing this in the short term? Obviously, this is very a DoD focused slide, but ultimately, if you think about things, we can't avoid AI. I'm not here to say like let's not use large language models. I think there's a huge power in them. Time saving alone, being able every time a new feature is introduced into the Intel development manual, being able to have something that can ingest that and then at least kind of spit back the a shorter version of how this works is a huge help from the system development side. So that's very impactful for me as I develop more system code. We do need to, however, train developers to understand what they're looking at. It's kind of like if you go to Stack Overflow, you copy paste the code and you hope it works. we now have large language models that'll generate a whole bunch of code for us. And we don't necessarily, we need to kind of introduce a training mechanism for people to look at that and really understand it better than just copy paste Stack Overflow code, because now we're going to get code at an even faster rate. And however, I think, a big thing that we can do is on the DoD side, they're considered open architectures. They're standard models, basically. So if you're familiar with like the OSI model and networking, it's basically guides to how things should interoperate. And the reason why, if we can define those well-defined interoperability guides, we can leverage a huge amount of strong research in formal verification, in secure hardware and secure operating system to secure those interface boundaries. And by doing that, at least we may be able to start compartmentalizing out some of the security vulnerabilities that exist within one part of the system and maybe not another, and trying to kind of provide some of the resiliency that we need there. And so more in the near term, this is a phenomenal talk. If you haven't seen it, Scaling the Security Researcher to Eliminate OSS Vulnerabilities Once and for All. I don't know if anyone's seen this, but it's I was talking to some other professors from Purdue today, and just the code QL part is hugely impactful. But this was one security researcher found a vulnerability in open source software, used code QL to scan that vulnerability, found the same vulnerability implemented almost exactly in a number of different open source repositories, then used the Open Read-Write toolset, which is another open source project, to take their vulnerability patch and then start transforming it to all of the different code systems. And then finally used Modern, which is a third tool to automate pull requests for all of those repositories. The interesting part about this is now you've got 5,200 pull requests on GitHub. And is that responsible disclosure? Because you just basically told 5,200 repositories that they have a 0 day in their system, or a 0 day plus one. Obviously, it's not responsible disclosure. The author of that paper agrees with that, but I think this is almost where we need to go, because this is effectively mitigation amplification. So we have this DevSecOps loop that tells us develop software and run it through a series of tools to protect that software repository. In this case, we're opening up that loop to encompass all of the open source software that's out there, which has been labeled critical infrastructure according to the US government now. And so not just working as security researchers to solve one problem on our set, how do we take our research that we're developing, and this is just one example of that, and be able to bring that to a larger community as we're conducting that research. However, longer term, a lot of the research that we do at Riverside Research, based off of another paper, trust-based security, or trust is considered harmful. A lot of this comes down to trust relationships. How do we implicitly trust the hardware to do something? How do we implicitly trust the software to do something? So if you trust, like a good example of this is if you trust your friend to watch your house while you're on vacation, to say take care of your dogs or water your plants, that friend could easily rob your house. They have a key to your house, you've trusted them, but then they've reneged on that trust. Similarly, in system software, we kind of build those same sorts of trust relationships. We trust the operating system to keep applications separate. We trust hypervisors to schedule VMs or operating systems. We trust the hardware layer, like the memory management unit. Don't mess up memory. Don't they do things like Spectre and Meltdown? Don't have these bugs in the system. And you see that a lot of times in assumptions of this is what our threat model is. This is what we're addressing. But we have a larger surface that we're trying to deal with. And ultimately, if you look at a lot of vulnerabilities, you get into the application, and then it's looking at how do I get privilege escalation in the kernel? How do I do VM escape at the hypervisor layer? And we just kind of try to get down to that bottom of the tower to compromise the entirety of the system. So how do we think about that differently? So in the short term, trying to get us off of that reactive posture a little bit. We have a lot of good work that's occurring now in tagged architectures. That's obviously a little bit further away A lot of that's happening on the RISC-V side. There is a hopefully soon to be commercial version of it called ARM Morello that came out of the Cherry line of processors that will allow us to start building more hardware tagging. If you look at the larger x86 ARM side, you're getting cache tagging now. Obviously not a lot of tags in there, but a little bit to start working with and experimenting with. Likewise, where I did a lot of my work was in the hypervisor introspection work. However, you're still reliant pretty heavily on third-party systems and software to provide those capabilities. Also, you'll often take a pretty big performance hit that most people won't want to necessarily give up if you're doing hypervisor introspection. Another interesting problem in this space is the co-processors. Great paper out there called "Putting Out the Hardware Dumpster Fire." We've actually ceded a lot of responsibility to our co-processors. So your GPU, your network card, they all do a lot of things that have been offloaded from what the kernel would necessarily historically have done in the past. And so there's a huge, I'd say, gap of research in looking at what those trust relationships mean. How do you know the network card isn't modifying or snooping on the traffic that you're potentially passing? We formally may have verified parts of the kernel, but who's looking at the network card? Who's looking at the GPU? Likewise, you're developing software, assuming in an anti-tamper space, and I built a huge fortress of security and hardware and software for the general purpose processor, and then I put my really expensive code into a GPU, and then an adversary comes along, pops off the GDR RAM, and now they have your AI model. So right now, the solutions that we have been looking at is leveraging things that have existed in COTS hardware, namely the memory management unit, since the Pentium 3. Being able to redefine the way things work by just changing up things ever so slightly that the processor from a hardware level doesn't necessarily care. So this work has been done on Zen. And this was done by some number of colleagues at Riverside Research, Scott Brooks, Jackson Smith, and Corey Reichel. And the work that they're doing is what you can see here in this very small print is if you look on the left in virtualization, you have physical memory, you have guest physical memory, and then you have the actual guest physical memory in terms of that layering. And then they do the virtual memory. And what you see is all the way on the left, you have Zen virtual addresses in that left picture. And then you have the guest physical addresses on the right picture, and then you have the true mappings in the middle, and everything in red is where they overlap. And so when you're doing a VM escape attack, you're trying to use what's shared mapping to break out. And it turns out the MMU and the IOMMU will work if you configure them and then remove all mappings. You leave the physical mappings alone. And what you see on the right is where we've removed all of those shared mappings. And then what you see in the blue is where we've removed the actual extended page table mappings. So we leave the physical addresses alone. We remove them completely from Zen. So you kind of excise out that entire memory, and the guest will continue to run with Zen operating. Obviously, you're going to lose some capabilities there because if you remove those mappings, then you remove the ability to do things like ballooning, being able to increase the size of the guest. But if you think in an edge processing world, you're oftentimes are just deploying something to the edge, you're locking it down. And in this way, we're removing some of that mapping. Obviously, there's other challenges there still in terms of denial of service that a bad guest could still just maliciously deny service through resource utilization. But just looking at things like memory management unit and the IOMMU and the extended page tables, you can actually change a lot of the system configuration without building new hardware, and oftentimes not changing a lot of software as well. Another separate approach is, if you're familiar with the formal methods work out there, there's historically then there's been a lot of specification using things like Coq and Isabelle to prove out that the code matches the specification. On our side, we looked at both TLA plus and universal composability. Universal composability is actually a pretty interesting one, and that's the one that we're using as part of the DARPA Hardin effort led by Mike Clark at our organization. And that started out as a cryptographic system type prover, where you are building out a cryptographic protocol, and there's some probability that there is going to be a vulnerability in your cryptographic protocol. And so the work they're doing there is extending that out of the cryptography domain using easy universal composability, or easy UC, which is a domain-specific language, to actually start composing it for system-of-system design. And so the work that they've been doing is building actual models of the secure boot world for UEFI. And they've been actually being able to uncover a number of undefined system behaviors as UEFI interacts with system management mode. And in doing so, they've been able to plug the gap between those two worlds of UEFI and SMM to remove vulnerabilities potentially before they were actually introduced in production UEFI code. Longer term, an interesting area of research is, if you move in the DoD parlance, it's model-based system engineering. Everywhere else, it's that digital twinning. How do we take modeling and sim capabilities that we're developing? In this case, we've developed modeling and sim capabilities on the universal composability side, and we're trying to use them to generate both the formal proofs and the software that would run in the digital twin to give you further guarantees of that system itself. However, there's obviously things where we don't want to necessarily get rid of, like Cock and Galena, things like flight controllers and certain types of software that are very safety critical. There's really good use cases for those there. Like, being able to prove that the flight controller will always operate on the timing that you want is always very helpful in terms of securing the system. So putting all of this together, is what we look at in these systems, is how do we enumerate attacker capabilities? And you have all of these different types of attacks, like out of replay, timing, rowhammer, meltdown, Spectre, enumerating all of those across hardware and software. We have to start doing that full capture of all of those security type vulnerabilities. And then we have to do at the design level. So actually, starting security prior to actually writing code, figuring out what those design type of parameters are. And then we have to kind of, actually constrain the system to what we can and what we can't protect against, and what we need to potentially develop future capabilities. So a good example of this is where we look at a lot of problems on the edge case of if you may take a action if you're detecting an anomaly or a security vulnerability on a commercial system, but likewise if you're operating on, say, a flight controller, and the pilot is 100 feet off the ground, you wouldn't necessarily turn the flight controller off 100 feet off the ground if you detected an anomaly or an attack. So you have to look at how these, as researchers, we have to look at how these systems as a whole function from a hardware and a software layer, and then actually start composing that full system of system security model. And by doing that, we'll be able to introduce security ideally earlier, and we also looking to scale it and being able to build it into these large ABIs or open architectures as we start providing all of those piece parts, and then being able to pull these full systems together, constrain them with known tools, scaling the security software developer so that we can actually not just solve the problem for one project, and pulling all of that together as a community. That's where I think we can actually start making that large scale impact of actually solving this challenge of ever increasing security vulnerabilities. And with that, I will take any questions. Go for it.
Rahul, can you use the microphone?
Yes, I'm audible. Yeah. Simple question, like I just saw in the presentation near the supply chain, the graphs which you drew.
Yes.
Over there, yeah.
This one.
I just noticed that the supply chain part was only limited to hardware and firmware. Any specific reason for it? Like, why is it not going on to the application or the software end as well?
So yeah, on the supply chain side, that's biased from my perspective of like so a lot of times we'll have actual hardware supply chain analysis of who is building this chip, where is it coming from, what's its country of origin, and the software supply chain is what we've historically called software assurance and software bill of materials. So that's really there's a little bit of a gray area in need of definition of, okay, where is the hardware supply chain end from physical devices? And then where do we start saying, okay, this firmware that was baked into the chip is part of the software supply chain, or is it all part of the software supply chain? Anything that, all the way down to like the ROM portion of the system and looking at that. So that's where, historically we did a lot of code signing, we did a lot of trusted boot. We did, obviously there's a whole host of like, signing of your public key and private key and doing all of that before you ever start anything on a system. You can get it down to, very granular levels where you have microprocessors that are verifying the firmware as it's loaded, which is obviously usually overkill for a lot of solutions that you need. But, looking at, I think that's an interesting gap ultimately to explore of, where is the software supply chain end and where does the hardware supply chain start and who's responsible for it? If I'm developing an application, do I need to know where my management engine code came from on my Intel processor? Those are things that we as a community need to figure out who's responsible for which portion, and then how do we manage that trust relationship.
Yeah, I've got a question
from online here. Working with the OS receives messages and interrupts by other components, which are then handled, converted, and sent through the kernel for execution. There are better strategies to protect memory corruption types of attacks, as you mentioned, ASLR and DEP, etc. But there may be strategies to have a seemingly legitimate component that maliciously injects valid instructions to cause the machine to perform in a compromised manner. Using mechanisms like encryption built into the processors now, what strategies do you suggest regarding message assurance to reduce message spoofing and/or instruction injection types of attacks?
It's a great question. So part of it I will, biasly answer because the interrupt work drove a lot of my thesis research. And you can actually do a lot of really interesting things with just interrupts alone and being able to partition the system based off of those interrupts. And you can actually reconfigure interrupt controllers, and internal to the CPU itself, there's interprocessor interrupts that you can start actually leveraging and taking back to, just the good old fashioned access control time and space of like, rather than sharing everything. A lot of work I did early in my career was, should the keyboard driver ever talk to necessarily, maybe the network card? Well, probably not. And you can create, customized interrupt setups to partition out those portions of the system. In terms of message passing itself, like, so if you built a message passing microkernel, encryption might be too heavyweight of a solution, depending on how you set that up. In terms of if everything's encrypted and then is decrypted at the same time, I think confidential computing is where that's trying to head, but it's containing that specific user's code, which could be as simple as an application or as as large as a Linux kernel itself, which we saw in some SGX instances. The ideal scenario that I try to target is, how do you break things down to the smallest compartment? So in this case, like maybe every function potentially would be being able to pass messages, which is where I would see encryption may struggle if everything is encrypted between those systems. There is a huge body of work in program analysis and being able to determine those control flows through the system of A should be talking to B. Big part of our research was looking at memory management units to block those types of transactions. So actually generating a page fault to then, basically do that access control check. So overall, I think it's a great question. I think if encryption, if it works out that it's fast enough that you can encrypt every single message between those boundaries at a function level, that would be amazing. But you may need to be doing a lot of trades of how much you're putting in one bucket and how much you're putting in another bucket to manage that performance impact. So a big thing that I failed to mention in this talk is oftentimes when people look at security, they want a performance impact of less than 1%. And so encryption, when you add that in, usually you're looking at a larger impact on performance. Another question? Yeah.
You mentioned tagged. You'd mentioned tagged architectures. I'm not entirely sure what that is. Could you explain what that is?
So I'm not a tagged architecture expert, but I will do my best. So in the ones that I'm familiar with are Cherry and the pipe architecture. And so assume every part of your code base has a tag associated with it. And the tags allow you to perform certain actions, either data or instruction actions. And if you don't have the tag associated with it, the correct action, then you're denied being able to take that action. That's a very high level overview of it. There's a lot of good papers out there. I'd recommend looking up the Cherry processor so it's CHERI for a bit more of a detailed explanation. But ultimately, it's kind of a very fine-grained hardware access control based technique. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just ask a very basic or maybe like a stupid question, but I saw something on your slides which is named like operator safety.
Yes.
So I like whatever you went through with the software security and securing the hardware. If we think as a developer, like somebody wants to explore new areas or do something kind of that, when we implement these kind of security, often the developers will go like, I don't have the freedom to do this, or I don't have the freedom to do that. So they might want like extended access. Like how do we when you talked about access control as well over here, like how do we ensure that we are giving the freedom, like in terms of software or the hardware, we are giving the freedom to the developers or the people who are making the chips and stuff. We are giving them the freedom to explore stuff while ensuring the security is there. So is that a gap? Or
it is? So it's definitely a large gap in this space, in that we can't expect the developers to implement our security mechanisms. So the work that we do in formal methods, actually on the front end of it, has a very simple GUI of building blocks. Like you put this block talks to that block, and so in system engineering, you have a very, very well-defined control flow of how data moves through the system. And in that front end GUI, on the back end, it's actually generating all of the formal methods code. So you don't necessarily have to be a PhD in terms of understanding that. Likewise, on the developer side, a big problem that we've seen and people are moving away from is making developers annotate their code to kind of put in the hooks. Ultimately, how to get the security into the system has to happen usually without the developer or the operator working on the system. So if you develop something for a product, you can't expect someone to open up command line and start debugging it in the field if it's not working. It has to be pretty much a seamless solution, which is where we've focused pretty heavily on just memory management units or existing ARM or x86 processors to build those things in the underlying kernel or virtualization layer, so that the application layer is unimpeded by those protections.
Okay, I think that's all we have.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.